I'm joined today by Alon Ziv, author of the book Breeding Between the Lines: Why Interracial People Are Healthier and More Attractive. Very, very interesting book, very, very interesting thesis here. Let's start by defining some basic terms so the audience and you and I can all be sort of on the same page. How are we describing if someone is healthier, and how are we describing if they're more attractive?
Good question. Breeding Between the Lines is a biology book. It's a pop science book, but everything I say in the book is supported by peer-reviewed academic studies from major institutions. A big concept in biology is symmetry. So the left side and the right side of your body are supposed to be identical mirror images, but some people get a little closer than others. And it turns out that symmetry is a really good indicator of genetic quality. So we look at people who are more symmetrical, even if it's so subtle that we can't consciously read how symmetrical they are. On some level, we're responding to that. And so there are a lot of great studies showing that more symmetrical people are healthier, more attractive, more fertile, more athletic, all kinds of great stuff. And it turns out that interracial people are significantly more symmetrical than people from a single race. And we've seen this from some really great studies recently that came out of UCLA and Penn State that found that, the more genetic diversity you have, which is something you get when your two parents are very different, the more symmetry you have.
We've been, of course, researching and looking at your book and looking at who agrees with you and who disagrees with you. And it's very interesting because there's no shortage of those who disagree with what you're saying. For example, we'll just start on this with regard to whether we call it symmetry or lack of asymmetry, as others describe it. But interestingly, there are white nationalists, white separatists, white supremacists who have taken it upon themselves to really try to counteract what you're saying. And while there are what I would consider sort of more less biased observers who have questions and problems with what you have said to some degree, there's this sort of white nationalist movement who really wants to prove you wrong. I mean, I'm sure you're aware of that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I get a lot of hate mail from these guys. Like you said, they go by various names: white supremacists, white nationalists, European nationalists. But they hate me. They hate my book, and so they're constantly attacking me and saying that I am part of a Jewish conspiracy to destroy the white race. And some of their arguments are very rudimentary, where they just send me mean emails saying "Die Jew." Some are more sophisticated, where they try to come up with genetic arguments to say that no, it's actually much better to stay within your group. I haven't found that their arguments hold much water. But I think it's a situation where they strongly believe something and they're looking for evidence to support it.
Well, I agree. I don't think their arguments hold much water, but in looking more broadly at what some of the critiques of your book are, the general critique seems to be, and I'd love to have you respond to it, that while, as you correctly say, you do cite sources, right? It's
Oh,
as you mentioned, it's
absolutely.
a pop sci book, but you are citing sources that are supportive of what you're saying. That you're
Exactly. And there's a
also
full
not include.
bibliography
I'm
and
sorry. Go
section
ahead.
of notes in the book.
Yes. The critique is you're also, some would say, conveniently not including sources that are at least not, that maybe don't confirm what you're saying or sometimes would go against it, right? An example of that would be the issue of the likelihood to react to being provoked that you talk about in those who are mixed race versus not mixed race, and the connection between this symmetry or lack of symmetry and responding aggressively when provoked. The critique is, and I'll open it up to you for comment,
Sure.
that indeed you do cite what your thesis is in the book, but that there are a number of studies that suggest the opposite, or at least that there is no definitive correlation. How do you address that critique?
Well, I do try to address, both sides of the argument in the book. Obviously, I believe that interracial people are healthier and more attractive, and I present a lot of evidence that is the case. I think one of the problems here is that there's a lack of evidence. Race is a very controversial topic, and the science of race is particularly controversial, and there are reasons for that. Science and race have a very ugly history where in the past, biology was used to justify racism, justify colonialism, to prove that Europeans were at the top of some kind of racial hierarchy. So I think because of that, there's a real reluctance on the part of scientists to study race in a meaningful way, which I think is a shame because I think we're throwing out the baby with the bathwater. But because of that, I don't think there's enough scholarship in this area. But the studies that I have found that do look at this specifically, that do look at, comparing interracial people to people from a single race, the results of those studies are very clear that there is a significant increase in symmetry and attractiveness for interracial people.
You mentioned what I sort of think is one of the most interesting things about your book and about the entire debate around this, which is, as you mentioned, sometimes there have been those who have attempted to use science to demonstrate that there is a race that is better, that is smarter, that is whatever you want to show. And at the same time, there is science that tries to show us that the opposite is true, that actually, for example, interracial individuals are healthier or more attractive or whatever. It's interesting that based on the results, some people react by saying one is racist or one is not, but science is science, right? So it's one of these things where we risk when we start looking into this, if the results go one way or the other, we might end up with something that appears, quote, racist, but really it would just be science, wouldn't it?
I agree 100%, but it turns out that often science is not just science, and I think the debate around race is similar to the debate around climate change, where you would think that climate change would be a scientific debate, but it's not. It's a political debate, because people have a lot invested in the idea of whether or not, man is changing the climate of the earth. And so I think it's the same thing here. People are not interested in just looking at the science. They have, there's clearly a lot of political baggage that comes along with it. And, I think people are kind of putting the cart before the horse there, where they say they already have their minds made up about race. And they're, anything that goes against that, no matter how scientifically rigorous, they're not going to like and they're going to push back against.
Is there some element here in your analysis of sort of cultural differences when we talk about symmetry, or maybe when we talk about, for example, waist to hip ratio among women, or whatever sort of factor we're looking at? How can we account for what are some pretty significant cultural differences in terms of what's considered attractive?
That's a really good question because obviously some elements of attractiveness are very culture specific. There are some things that we might find attractive that people in Africa might find unattractive, or vice versa. But luckily, there's a lot of great scholarship in this area, in the area of attractiveness, and people have done great studies cross culturally where they're looking at Europeans and Americans and Asians and Africans, and even trying to do tests on indigenous tribes that have had almost no exposure to Western media. And so there are a few things that they find cross-culturally. No matter who you are or what part of the earth you're from, people like symmetry. Like you mentioned, they like a certain waist to hip ratio, which indicates curviness. People like clear skin. There's no culture on earth that likes people who are asymmetrical, that likes women who deviate from the ideal waist to hip ratio, that likes people who have blemished or pocked skin. Those are all universally seen as attractive, and the reason is that they're indicating something about the health of the individual. Waist to hip ratio is associated with fertility. Clear skin is associated with being disease-free. Symmetry is associated with having good genes. And so in situations like that, where these things are hallmarks for good genetic quality or good health, that's universal.
Let's talk a little bit more about the health side of this. There's sort of a general area of scholarship which suggests, just as a general principle, when you have more genetic diversity, you are reducing the possibility of certain diseases or predispositions to diseases or illnesses by just basically taking an average of broader, more differentiated genetic bases. Is that the sort of general principle underneath the interracial is healthier suggestion? Is there more to it? How can we elaborate on that?
Yeah, good question. So yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, on the most basic level, the more genetic diversity you have, the less likely you are to have genetic disorders. We know that there are a lot of recessive genetic disorders out there. Every ethnic group kind of has their own batch of disorders that they have to worry about. If you're European or from European ancestry, you have to worry about cystic fibrosis. If you're of African ancestry, you have to worry about sickle cell anemia. If you're of Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry, you have to worry about Tay-Sachs and that family of diseases. So obviously, when we bring different genes together, then you're less likely to get two copies of those bad genes and end up with those genetic disorders. But on a more general level, we're seeing that even, not on the level of diseases, but just when you have two different copies of a gene from your two parents, it creates kind of a buffering effect. And so the genetic disorders are the most extreme example of that, but it also works on a much more subtle level, which allows your body to just develop to handle different scenarios and develop into a healthy, symmetrical body.
Given what is very clear sort of shrinking of the world based on air travel, based on immigration, etc., there's a lot of speculative fiction, science fiction, which in a future scenario suggests, speculates that increasingly there's going to be sort of one race and that we are not going to see racial distinctions as we sort of know them today. How realistic is something like that? Is that a sort of reasonable prediction?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, Breeding Between the Lines came out 10 years ago, and at the time, I predicted that we were on the cusp of a mixed race explosion, at least in America. I felt that all the population demographics had lined up in a way that we were about to see just a huge rise in interracial people. And that's one of the reasons why we've released the new edition now, because I wanted to point out, yes, that's absolutely what has happened. And if you look in the United States, 1 in 10 babies born today is mixed. And in 1970, it was 1 in 100. So we've seen a tenfold increase in only 40 odd years. And the babies of tomorrow are even more so. If we look at marriages, 15% of new marriages in the US cross racial or ethnic lines. So, the babies of tomorrow are going to be 15%. And in some states, it's more than 25%. So we're definitely heading in that direction. But I do have to caution that that's not a panacea. I often point to Brazil as a model because Brazil has a huge history of racial mixing, and in a recent survey, 43% of Brazilians identified themselves as mixed. But that has not led to, it hasn't solved all of Brazil's racial problems. They
No, I mean, in
still
fact,
have.
Brazil is sort of known in some ways as a place where, although there is significant diversity, it is also segregated in a great way.
Absolutely, and I always like to joke that Brazil's chief export is supermodels, and I think that that may have to do with all of, the racial mixing that they've done. But you're absolutely right that they still have a lot of problems with racism, and it's just become a little bit more of a hierarchy. I think there's still advantages to being lighter skinned in Brazil and disadvantages to being darker skinned, but there's just many more categories. One recent Brazilian census had 134 different categories for race.
We've been talking about the new edition of Alon Ziv's book, Breeding Between the Lines, Why Interracial People Are Healthier and More Attractive. Very, very interesting. Thanks so much for talking to us about it.
Thanks for having me.